This presentation is a recording of an introduction to the Center-Based Childcare and Preschool Program regulations that are effective September 1st, 2016. This was presented by Crystal Michaud, Licensing Supervisor, and Heather Madison, Operations Administrator at the Vermont Department for Children and Families Child Development Division. This webinar was presented for training hours. However, training hours are not available for viewing this version of the presentation. The focus of this presentation is to introduce the process of regulation training and to provide basic information on how to read the regulations. For answers to specific questions about your program, please call the licensor on duty at 1-800-649-2642.
Well, good evening, everybody. We want to just start by talking about the objectives, learning objectives and goals of tonight's webinar. The first one is to spend some time talking about the implementation plan or the rollout plan and what to expect over the next several months and years we're working on achieving compliance to these new regulations. The second thing that we hope to accomplish tonight is to spend some time reviewing basic tips with how to read licensing rules, and that will really help you with a lot of your questions as you're working through compliance. And then the last thing we'll spend some time on tonight is sharing of resources that are available that will also help you achieve compliance to these rules. So if we start with talking about the timeline, the implementation plan, back earlier this summer, we had these regulations adopted, and one of the things that we've done since then is develop the frequently asked questions survey. That's on the Child Development Division website. Anybody can log in and provide a question to a rule that they have. In this section, we're asking you for the rule number. If it's a general question or there's several rules that you're asking the question about, you can enter in more than one number, or you can just write general question. The survey will accept that for an answer. We are collecting all of those questions and starting to develop responses, and we're posting those to the division's website. So you'll want to routinely go there and see what new information might exist. And there is a system for being able to identify newer postings that are happening. We plan on continuing to update that weekly at this point. One of the other things we did back at the end of June was have a community partner meeting, which included our resource development specialists and VAC and Vermont Birth to 5 mentors from around the state, and sharing with them a lot of the same information that we're sharing with you tonight so that they're able to be good supports. The other thing that has been more recent that we've done this summer is mail out a copy of the regulations to all programs. We also provided all your local resource agencies with additional copies of the regulations. So if you need more copies for whatever reason or know of anybody that would like a copy, you certainly can refer them, or you yourself can go to the local resource and referral agency in your area and get that. And as they run low, they will let us know and we will replenish their supplies. Beginning in August, we had a meeting with the starting points leaders from around the state, also sharing with them this same information that we're sharing with you. And then we're mid-August now, and we're doing these webinars. Yesterday, we held this same webinar for home-based programs based on their new rules, and today we've done it earlier this afternoon and now this evening for center-based programs. The other significant thing that's happening this month is training the licensors on the rules and the other licensing staff here at CDD. So the big piece of this timeline that we're all very well aware of is the effective date, September 1st of 2016. And I really would encourage us to see that as a very small point in time. You know, the day before and the day after will look very similar. As you can see from the arrow on the timeline, that this is really a process, and we know that achieving compliance will take time. So that one particular date is one point in this process, but certainly in and of itself isn't the biggest piece. One of the other things that we'll be doing this month not this month, this fall, is mock compliance visits. And I want to explain a little bit about what those are. Once the licensing staff are trained here at the division, the licensors will need an opportunity to take their learning from the classroom setting out into the field and really ensure that they have a clear understanding of the rules and that they're consistent with application of that. And so one tool for them to be able to do that are these mock compliance visits. There'll be an opportunity for programs to volunteer to participate in these mock compliance visits. And what we'll ask people to do is to fill out an application on our website. That'll let us know that you're interested and available. We're going to choose programs that apply from around the state. Any program that we do select to participate in that mock compliance visit will be contacted directly by our licensing team, and that visit will be a scheduled, announced visit. If the licensee and or director both want to be present for that and for the debriefing of that visit, that's recommended. It'll be a really great opportunity to get a sense of where your program is at, what you're still working on, any specific questions you have about the rules as they relate to your program. So because that's a mock compliance visit, we will not be citing violations during that visit. It's an educational opportunity, both for the program that's volunteering as well as for the licensing staff. With that being said, I do want to recognize that should something occur during that visit that was egregious or would be considered a serious violation, such as a staff member using corporal punishment and spanking a child, that is something that we would still have to cite. But for the reason why we're there and most of what we would be assessing, that would all be an educational opportunity and cited as narratives about where the program is at and what would be next steps or where they're all set. We did this earlier this year with after-school programs. It was very well received and it was a great benefit. One thing you may want to know about those visits is that our licensors would be doing them in teams of 2. So 2 licensors would come, and in some instances the licensing supervisor would accompany them, and they'll spend time, the 3 of them or the 2 of them, talking together throughout the visit and at the end to see where their consistency lies and what clarification questions they have. The other thing we'll be doing in the fall is deploying updates to BFIS as a result of some of the new rules. And when that happens, like when it's happened in the past, we'll notify you and you'll have a chance to get familiar with what changes have been made. Some of those changes may be more internal on our end and others will be components that you'll see. For example, in the application, there might be some new components as it relates to these rules. Then later in the fall, heading into winter, we'll have online and community-based trainings, and we are designing those to be online or community-based trainings so that it really meets different people's needs and availability. And those trainings will be specific on your set of regulations, and it will be an in-depth look at different pieces and components of them. Where this webinar tonight is more of an overview, and so we won't really be spending a lot of time answering direct questions about specific rules. Instead, we'll be spending the time talking about the tips and ways to read a rule and understand it. In the trainings that will happen at the end of the fall, beginning of winter, those will be really in-depth on specific questions, specific rules. And that training will meet the requirement for the Rule 134, which says all licensees will attend a training specific to these regulations approved by the division. And it says licensees, so anyone who owns a licensed program would need to attend. If they also wanted their director or staff to attend as well, or directors or staff want to attend, they're certainly welcome to, but it's the licensees who are required by this particular rule to attend. The other thing I want to mention about this particular online and community-based training is that we already have a licensing regulation training that we do as part of the fundamentals class that happens. And that training, the licensing regulation training for the fundamentals, is really intended for somebody who's new to the profession. So the first half of that training is spent on looking at who its CDD is and licensing unit and what to expect during a licensing visit. And the second half of the training is really spent on learning how to read rules using scenarios, and it will use these new regulations. Where the training I'm talking about here on this timeline is specific to these rules as it relates to the Rule 134. So when you're looking for that, you're going to want to look for 134 to be titled in the training, and we'll be pretty clear that it meets that. So you'll know the difference between those. The other thing that will be happening around that same time period is there'll be additional changes to BFIS. There's a good handful of changes that will be happening, and we can't do them all at the same time. The second round of that will happen. And like I said earlier, some of the changes will be very clear to you, and other changes might be more behind the scenes. Other examples of changes that will be happening is updating position titles in BFIS. So that will be happening then. And then later in the winter, we'll be finishing up the writing of the guidance manual. So each set of regulations will have a guidance manual that accompanies it. People have asked us if we'd already started on those and if they would come out at the same time. And it is not possible to write guidance manuals when you haven't adopted rules yet, because rules throughout the regulation process can continue to change, and they certainly did throughout this process. So at the very end, before this set of regulations were adopted, we were reviewing public comments and feedback that we had received, and we made many, many changes to the rules as a result of that feedback, whether it was to modify wording or delete a rule. So you can see that we really had to wait until the rules were adopted before we could develop the guidance manuals. So we'll be doing that. It also falls in alignment with using the frequently asked questions, the mock compliance visits, the online and community-based trainings. Those will all help inform the process about the kinds of things people have questions about when they read the rules and what would be the best guidance to put in that manual. Okay. So Crystal, we have a couple questions that have come in. The first one is, who is the licensee if you're in a public school? The director at the supervisory union level is required. Is it the director at the supervisory level and not a classroom teacher? So the licensee is the entity that owns the program. So if a program is a sole proprietorship, usually a particular individual is the licensee. If the program is a corporation, like a school, then the school is actually the licensee, and they would identify a representative that is the liaison for information sharing between the business entity and the licensing division. And in some cases, that might be the person identified as the director. In other cases, it might be the principal or a superintendent. It depends on how that governing body as a corporation wants to identify their representative. That's a great question. Okay. And so just to clarify, this training tonight is not the training that covers the Regulation 134. Right. This is just an introduction to start to give people some understanding about what to expect over the next several months, and to get some tips about reading licensing rules, and it'll really help you start to answer some of your questions. But it's not an in-depth rule by rule answering questions about specific rules. This is more of an overview. Okay. And so we do have a very specific question that we might be able to cycle back to, but at this point I'm going to just hold on to it so we can move on to the next part. Great. So we want to talk about compliance monitoring over the next year. And we want to just start by talking about the approach that the Child Development Division is going to take towards compliance monitoring, and that is working together as a team. There's, all different parts to our team. There's yourself, there's community partners such as resource development specialists and mentors, there's the licensing unit, there's parents. And we all play an important role when we think about compliance monitoring. And it's really important that we understand each person's role and we utilize people within their role. So if you have a question about, you're trying to develop a policy or procedure around emergency response planning, and you have questions about that, you're going to want to contact those mentors or professionals in your community that have the training and expertise around emergency response planning, and they'll be able to tell you what recent research says. They'll be able to talk to you about best practices, and it'll really inform your process of developing policies or procedures or revising them or updating them. If you have a question about, a licensing rule and how to interpret it or what does it mean, if you have a question about a licensing process, you're going to want to call the licensor on duty line and ask that question. If you're working on maybe emergency response planning and you're not quite clear on what the licensing rule is, you might start by calling the licensor on duty line and gaining that clarity, and then you want some resources and supports and ideas around how to develop your policy or procedure, and then you might contact your local resource agency and see who might be available to help you with that. And they'll focus on best practice now that you already have the understanding about what the licensing rule requires. So we're all going to be working together from our individual perspectives, and you certainly should feel free to call the licensor on duty line any time as you're continuing to work through those licensing components of that. The other thing we want to talk about for compliance monitoring is really understanding that achieving compliance is going to take the next year. Right now, we're all wanting to spend a lot of time with reading the rules. Once you've read them once, you're going to want to read them 2 or 3 more times. Every time you read them, you're going to become more familiar about which rules are where in the book. You might read from a different perspective each time, and so things that you didn't quite pay attention to or pick up on the first time around is going to stand out at you more. When you're reading things and there's so much in different places, it feels so new that it's really hard to see it all the first time you read it. You might want to read a second or third time with a purpose of highlighting those things that you have questions about versus those things that you want to make some changes in your program to achieve compliance. Then you're really going to want to start to think about how over the next year you're going to achieve compliance to these rules. And you're going to want to start to develop a plan. There may be some things that you could do right off that are pretty straightforward and simple and won't take a lot of time. There may be some things that you have to think about, like policy changes. And so you want to plan the next several months to really develop those. And there may be some things that is going to have a cost associated with it. And so you really want to project that out over time so you can put money aside to be able to achieve compliance in that area. So you're going to want to start developing those plans. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we do have an exception where existing staff who need to do additional education to meet the new qualifications, they have 2 years to achieve compliance to that. And the other thing that's important to comment around this is that if there's a rule that you feel like you can't achieve compliance right now with, and something you're going to have to strive towards, now is not the time to file a variance request for that. Because you have a year to come into compliance, and for qualifications, that's 2 years. So right now you should be focusing on what you can do to come into compliance. Towards the end of that 1-year time period, or 2 years if it has to do with qualifications, if you're finding that there's a particular rule you still need a little bit of time with, or you have one staff member who still needs 2 more months to finish up some education that they're doing to meet the new qualifications, at that time is when you're going to want to submit a variance request. And in your variance request, you're going to want to show what you've been doing over this past year or 2 years if it's related to qualifications, and be really specific about what are the final steps that are needed and exactly how much more time you have. So over the next year, while we are doing compliance visits, The next question we oftentimes get asked is, well, what about non-compliance? If I have a year to come into compliance, how can I do that? And you come during a compliance visit, aren't you going to cite something as non-compliance? Our goal is really to use the compliance visits as educational opportunities and to really support programs with understanding the new rules that they need to come into compliance with, assessing where they're at. You might have made some change, but it wasn't quite enough, and we'll be able to talk with you about that. With that being said, the things that we'd still be focusing on citing for non-compliance during that time period are the things that really did not change. You know, you still need to use positive guidance practices, and if we see that that's not happening in a program, that rule hasn't changed, we would still be citing that. You still need to maintain supervision of children. You know, they can't be going off down a hall or in another room where they're not, you know, tended to directly in visual sight. So that we would, you know, still need to be citing. So most of it we're going to be using as educational opportunities, but for those rules that really have not changed, then that we would still be citing as non-compliant.
Okay, so Crystal, we did receive a couple questions. One I'm going to ask and another one that I'm going to hold on to for a little while. And so one is just kind of circling back to something that you said, and it is a clarification that you referenced the fundamentals course. And it's just a question to clarify, is the fundamentals course what used to be called child development or a 30-hour course?
Yes. The fundamentals is one of the options under the old rules where it required a child development.
Okay.
Okay. Well, now that we've talked a little bit about the timeline and what to expect over the next year, let's spend some time talking about reading licensing rules. And there's three things we want to do in terms of talking about reading licensing rules. One is talking about the table of contents. The other is talking about definitions. And the third is talking about something that we like to call what it says it means. So let's start with table of contents. And if you have your regulations book handy, go right ahead and open it to the table of contents section. Right at the top of that page, it says mission. And the mission of the Child Development Division is to improve the well-being of Vermont's children. We do this through partnership with families, communities, schools, providers, and state and federal agencies that increase access to high-quality, sustainable child development services. And then right underneath the mission statement starts the table of contents. So the table of contents is a really important part of this regulation book because it really helps you start to see how the book is organized and where you're going to be able to find things within the book. So you see at the top, it says Section 1, Introduction. And the introduction of the regulations is really the broadest perspective you can really take when you're understanding regulations. And you can see in that section it's talking about the legal authority to regulate, the effective dates of these rules. And when you're thinking about the legal authority to regulate, that's where the division has the statutes, the laws behind what we do as for regulation. And from there, from the introduction, we move into Section 2, which is general provisions. And under general provisions, you see that it includes things like definitions, licensing process and procedures, rule variances, public record of violations. So you can really start to see that general provisions now is bringing you a little bit more narrower perspective than the introduction, which is about the authority to regulate. And it's really starting to talk about regulations and licensing and all the different components that come with that. And as you shift from Section 2 into Section 3, you definitely see a shift. So now we're narrowing even further. And Section 3 is administration and operations, which is really about how a program operates. And within that section, you see governing body. Governing body is what identifies who the licensee really is. This section covers program management and record keeping, emergency preparedness, confidentiality. So you can see that Section 1 is your biggest, legal authority to regulate. Section 2 starts to narrow in and really focus on licensing and different components of that and definitions and understanding this book. 3 is now looking at a program and how you organize the program. And before you go any further, Section 4 goes right into talking about parent and family engagement. And within that, it talks about, you can see there, it includes pre-enrollment visits, parent conferences, parent communication, activities to encourage parental involvement. So before you get much more beyond looking at the program, you start to talk about, in these rules, the interconnectedness between the program and the family. And then you turn the page, and you see that there is another shift that happens in this book. So now we start to delve more specific into components of a program. And Section 5 is probably one of the biggest components in this book, which is health, safety, and nutrition. And as you can imagine, those are big headings. So there's a lot of different aspects of health. Child health, routine health practices. You're talking about managing infectious illnesses and diseases, sleep, oral health, administration of medication. So health on many different levels within the program. Safety is also a large section. Section 510, physical environment and safety. And so it's all the different aspects of safety within the program and the space both inside and out. And then it ends on food and nutrition. So now that we've really tackled that component of a program, Section 6 gets into teaching and learning. So now that you have the space set up and your policies and procedures around health and safety, you want to think about curriculum and all the things that go along with teaching and learning, ratios, supporting children with special needs, all that's going to be in that section. And then from that section, we get into Section 7. Now that you have all the components of the program, you need to think about staffing. Who's going to be part of this program and provide these services? So Section 7 is program personnel and staffing, and it covers background checks and qualifications and professional development, a couple of unique roles like business managers and volunteers. And then from Section 7, we go into Section 8, which is exceptions for specially designated programs. And you can see that there's two sections within Section 8. One is non-recurring services. So any program that's a non-recurring program, that section of the rules is going to tell you which rules you have exceptions to and what those exceptions do or don't look like. The other one is public school pre-kindergarten programs. And you'll notice in that one that there's only a couple exceptions. And the main reason for that is because when we started thinking about what exceptions should look like for public school, preschool, pre-kindergarten programs, we realized that it really focused on teaching licenses. And then we started to ask ourselves, well, if you have a teaching license, does it really matter which environment that you're specifically teaching in, a public school versus a private program in the community? And we decided that the location wasn't the important piece. The important piece was that you had a teaching license. So any exceptions that we've made for those who hold teaching licenses are right in the Section 7, the personnel section. And so it really left very few exceptions for public school pre-kindergarten programs. And you don't want to stop there. After Section 8 is Appendix A and B, and those are just as important documents in this regulation as any other section. Appendix A is going to be familiar to you. It's the same signs and symptoms chart. You will want to read it because we have updated it based on research and current national and state standards around health practices. So while the chart itself is going to be familiar to you, some of the sections in it have been modified slightly. And then Appendix B addresses crib safety and anything you would need to know about that based on new manufacturer requirements. So I think once you really take a look at the table of contents, you'll see how it can really help you know where to go in this book to find certain rules. One of the things I do want to point out is that a couple things happened. One of our biggest goals with this revision process was bringing clarity. And when you bring clarity, that really means more words to make sure everyone's clear of what's being said and what's being required. But another element of bringing clarity was also committing to having licensing policies and procedures more clearly spelled out within the regulations in a way that they had never been before. So in your current regulations, there's about 8 pages related to licensing policies and procedures. In this set, there's 27 pages. We slightly more than tripled the amount of rules that we put in around licensing policies and procedures. So that's something to think about as you're looking at that. So I want to spend some time going into the next piece here, definitions. And here's another place. In the current early childhood regulations, there's about 46 definitions, and in this set of regulations, there's about 65. There's a couple things, and if you turn to page 4, section 2.2, you're going to see the definitions section start. And there's a couple important things for you to know about the definitions section. One is that a definition itself is not a licensing rule. We would never cite that. A definition is to help you understand the licensing rules. So some of the questions we've gotten in the frequently asked questions is, well, I looked up the definition for partner staff, but it doesn't tell me whether or not they can be alone with children or count in ratio. Well, that's because you're going to want to go to section 6 around teaching and learning that talks about ratios, and you're going to want to see what the rules are about which staff can do what in that regard. But when you find the word partner staff used in a licensing rule, if you can't quite remember what that means, you go to the definition and it'll tell you what that means. So the definitions will help you understand how to read a rule, but in and of themselves, they're not a rule. The other thing that's important to know about the definitions is that we were selective about what words we put in here. Some words we didn't feel the need to put into these definitions because when you look the word up in the dictionary, we're using the dictionary definition. And an example of that would be the word substantial compliance. That's a legal term. When you look it up in the dictionary, it tells you what it means, and it's exactly how we're using. So it doesn't need to be in our definition section. The words we chose to put in the definition sections were words where we're changing the definition to meet our profession and to help explain the rules that are in this book. So one example would be the word sensory. And if everyone could find the word sensory in their book in the definition section, and when you find it, if you can tell us what page it's on, we'll wait here for just a second for someone to find it and tell us what page.
Page 9.
Great. Thank you. So if you look on page 9, you'll see sensory at the top. It's Rule 2248. And I want to stop for a second and talk about how I'm referring to the rule. You'll notice that I'm not using the points. I'm not saying 2.2.48. I'm using them as whole numbers. So I'm not saying 2248. I'm reading each whole number, 2248. And that's how we'll refer to it. When we're writing, you're going to want to put the points in so you can see the whole numbers. But the word sensory in here, it says means the intentional and concrete means of supporting each child's individual learning style by providing opportunities to learn through the 5 senses. So when you read this, you really see that if you went and looked this up in the dictionary, it's not going to talk about senses, sensory in the form of your senses. Here, we've added on when we talk about the intentional and concrete way that you're supporting children's learning through the senses and you're individualizing their learning style. So here's an example of a word where we've gone beyond the dictionary definition, and that's why we wanted to put it in here. And when you go to the curriculum section, which again would be section 6, teaching and learning, and you are reading different curriculum rules, and you see the word sensory being used, and you're like, okay, how was that being defined? You can go here and it'll help you understand. So the definition section of this book, as you can see, is a pretty integral part. And oftentimes when someone has a question about a rule, if we stop for a minute and go to the definition section and you read it and then go back and read the rule, it'll really help bring it some clarity around what it's saying. I think the next piece we want to talk about is what it says it means. And this is a really important piece of this, because it's important to understand that if a rule doesn't say it, it can't mean it. It can only mean exactly what it says. And we want to spend some time on this part, because I think this is where it really is helpful to look at some concrete examples. So we're going to look at this rule, Rule 343. If you're in your book, I'll give you a second to find that. And whoever finds it, if you can just post the page number. So Rule 343.
31.
Great, thank you. And when we look at this rule, it says, a system for taking attendance, including documentation of the time when each child arrives and departs each day he or she attends the center, shall be established. The licensee shall save all daily attendance records identifying the hours of children's attendance for at least 12 months from the date that care is provided. So let's break this down just a little bit. It starts off by saying a system for taking attendance. So when it says a system, it's not prescribing a set way to develop a system. It's just saying you have to have a system. So that gives you flexibility. If it doesn't tell you it has to be a paper system, then you can decide. You might have a paper system or you might have an electronic system. And we have lots of programs that do it both ways. And both ways meet compliance to this rule if the other components in this rule are met. So the other components would be documenting the time each child arrives and departs each day. And then the other component down further on is that the attendance is able to be kept and referred to over 12 months. So whatever system you develop, if it is documenting arrival and departure time for each child each day, and you have it for the last 12 months, that system meets this rule. So that's important, because a lot of times we're getting questions about rules of, it doesn't say this or it doesn't say that, so can I do it? And you can see here that what's being said is a system, so you have choice. Another piece that's important in this example is that it doesn't say that parents have to sign children in or out, or that the program has to sign children in or out. It says that the documentation has to be completed. So some programs choose to have parents do it. Some programs choose to have staff do it. That's your choice. If you do have parents do it, you might want to have a system for making sure that it's completed, because ultimately the program's held accountable if it's not done. So you might need to do it yourself. And there's reasons why some programs choose to have parents do it. Sometimes they might have an incident that comes up later, and they want to see who was the person that dropped off or picked up the child as it would relate to that. And so having parents document it in initial is a way to be able to look back. So sometimes programs have reasons why they want to do it a certain way. The other thing to think about, another tip regarding reading these rules, is you really want to make sure that you're reading the whole rule. We can oftentimes find ourselves stopping after the first sentence. Okay, now you read the first sentence and you think, okay, I need to have a system. I need to have time in and time out for each child each day. Okay, I'm good. Got it. Got my system. But the last sentence is just as important, because it talks about how long that needs to be maintained. So if you're using a system that writes, like electronic system maybe, and it saves over itself after 60 days, you might find that that system doesn't really meet this rule. And so by reading the whole rule, you'll find pieces that relate back and forth with each other that are important. One of the questions we oftentimes get with a rule like this is, so I only have to keep my attendance for 12 months? Well, that's kind of a tricky question with a tricky answer. For licensing, you only need to keep it for 12 months. Licensing is not going to ask you for attendance from 2 years ago, because the rule says 12 months. Maybe the financial assistance program asks you to keep it longer. Maybe your accountant or tax preparer says you should be keeping it longer. There may be other reasons to keep attendance records longer than the 12 months, but as far as it pertains to licensing, 12 months is what we require.
Okay, so we have received some questions that are specific to this rule, and I've also received some additional questions that I am going to hold until we've gone through some samples, and then we'll go run through them so we can practice. So the first question was about the 12-month cycle. Can public schools have a school year cycle instead of a 12-month cycle?
A school year cycle or a 12-month cycle is essentially the same thing. If your school operates 9 months out of the year and then is closed during the summer months, you do have a 12-month system. It's just 3 months doesn't have any record because you weren't open. But that still is a 12-month system.
Okay. So this is a very specific example. If the program runs an 8 to 12, and then attendance is called up to the main office in a public school, does that count as a system for taking attendance? And also, so any kind of alternative of that, of calling attendance somewhere else, does that count?
So that's a really great question, because it really asks us to think about, what is this rule saying? It's saying you have to have a system. You've just described a system. It's saying that the system needs to know arrival and departure time. Just because it's a public school and it's open from 8 to 12 for the preschool program doesn't mean all children arrived at 8 and all children left at 12. So if you have a child arriving late or leaving early, for a doctor's appointment or because they're not feeling well, those different arrival and departure times are required to be documented. So the system that you're giving here as an example, if it does that, it might meet the rule. You want to be mindful that some public school systems, and I'm just going to share this out of experience, some public school systems, their main office record keeping isn't time in and time out. It is present or tardy or absent, and they don't actually have the time in and time out. If it does, it might meet the requirement. So it'll really be your responsibility to check with, well, if I use the school's main office system, does it actually meet each of these components?
Okay. And the next question is similar, but a little different. If a program has a morning program and an afternoon program that has 2 different teachers and different classrooms, is it necessary to sign in to the next classroom or just when the child leaves the campus at the end of the day?
I think, again, it depends on the system that you set up. If you have all children on the same roster, paper roster, maybe in alphabetical order, and it starts off in the first classroom with that group of teachers and they sign children in, and half of those children leave and they sign them out, the other half continue on to the next classroom, the attendance goes with them, the next group of teachers sign in any new children that have come into the program in their arrival time, and then signs everybody out at the very end. That scenario certainly meets this rule. So it's really thinking about what system am I using and then check it against the different components of the rule to see if there's any piece that doesn't fit. And if your system doesn't fit, you might just need to make one slight shift. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to create a whole new system. So you want to really check it against the rule, see where it fits and where it might not, and think about how you want to adjust it where it doesn't. So that's what I would say is a good strategy for checking what you do against the licensing rule.
Okay, and so we're going to take this last question and then we'll move on to the next example. It is, do we need to have a note for families to sign saying it's okay for us to sign their child in and out of our program when going to daycare after pre-K?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you just read that one more time?
So does the program need permission, a written permission, from the parent, giving them permission to sign the child out to when they're being picked up from or dropped off at daycare or from pre-K?
I think that this question comes back to something I think I said a little bit earlier. This rule doesn't require parents to be the ones to sign children in and out. So as this question relates to the attendance, that may be your practice, but this rule doesn't require parents sign children in and out, and so you don't really need parents' permission to sign them in and out. If you're asking this question from the perspective of, can I release the children to the child care program, that's a different question. That's a whole other set of rules around who do you have parental permission to authorize children leaving with somebody other than the parent, or going someplace other than the parent's care. And that's a separate question.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the next example.
Okay. So this one is Rule 510-313. And if you can take a second and flip to that, and when you find it, if you can tell us what page you found it on. 510-313. 60. Great, thank you. You guys are very fast. 510-313. So this rule says the play area shall be fenced or otherwise protected from traffic and other hazards. Fencing or natural barriers such as hedges or other clear land boundaries shall prevent children from exiting and allow for safe supervision of outdoor play. So this rule is really interesting. I think it's oftentimes easy when we start reading this rule that we think, oh, okay, play areas have to be fenced. And that's not actually what this rule is saying. This rule isn't saying that all outside play areas need to be fenced. It's talking about when a fence is needed. And a fence is needed when there's traffic or other hazards. The other thing that's interesting about this rule is it uses the word or during the first sentence, and in the second sentence it uses the word and. So let's talk about those two words for a second, because they can kind of trip us up. When the word and is being used in a rule, it means that whatever comes before it and after it both have to be true. And when it's using the word or, it's saying you have an option. So in the first sentence it says, shall be fenced or otherwise protected. And then in the next sentence it gives you examples, fencing or natural barriers such as hedges or other clear land boundaries. So the second sentence starts to give you more clarity about what's meant by otherwise protected, now calling them natural barriers, and it's giving you examples of hedges. And then what the second sentence really does is tell you what the barrier has to accomplish. It has to prevent children from exiting, and it has to accomplish allowing for safe supervision of outdoor play. So when we start to put all these pieces together, it really starts to create a clearer picture. And when you're looking at a rule like this, and you're realizing that it's a rule that applies if there's hazards, you want to think about how you're looking at your outside area and identifying what hazards may or may not exist. And in Vermont, those hazards might be rivers or pools or train tracks, roads. It can also mean electric fences and farm animals, depending on where you're located in Vermont. We have a lot of center-based programs that might be on a farm or near a farm. So you really want to look around at your hazards, and you want to remember that some hazards come and go. So for example, you might not have had any hazards, and now either you've decided to introduce farm animals to your program, or somebody, the property beside your child care program has gotten some horses and they put up an electric fence. So it is possible that hazards weren't there at one point and they are there now. When you identify that hazards exist, you want to think about what's really needed to protect children from that. Sometimes that fence is really what's needed. Otherwise, there's other barriers that already exist. Whenever you're looking at this, I would always encourage people to call the licensor on duty line and ask those questions. So this is what I'm thinking I'm finding for a hazard. Am I on the right track? Am I looking at this accurately? And then you want to talk about, so this is how I think I'm going to address it. Is there anything I'm not thinking of or anything else you might suggest? And we can talk you through some of that on the phone. Whenever you're making changes to your interior or your exterior space, you always want to be starting, and I would recommend even before you start making any changes, when you're in the planning stages, call the licensor on duty line and talk about the kinds of things you want to be mindful of and the steps you need to take. And sometimes those changes will require approval from the division once the changes are completed. You want to contact us and schedule a licensing visit. So this kind of rule is something we would really do in partnership with each other. We'd really provide guidance and oversight. Any questions about this particular rule?
So we have one question about fencing. We have a fence between our play area and our outdoor space and a brook that has 2 gates to the brook area. Do the gates need to have some type of lock on them?
That's a really good question. And the rules around what a fencing needs to look like are also in this section. But it starts off by saying, and it's rule, I'm going to name the rule number so you can see it. It's 510315, and it starts off by saying fencing installed after the effective date of these regulations. So when you're asking me about an existing fence, we're going to go to our general safety hazards rule and say, is the fence sturdy? Is the fence accomplishing its purpose? Is the fence in good repair? So that if it's a wood fence, are there nails and screws protruding? If it's a metal fence, are there any metal hooks that hold the fencing together to the support poles that might be sticking out? That could be a puncture concern for children. So your existing fences, you're going to think about from a safety perspective. So this rule says if you're installing a fence after the effective date, and then it gives you the bullets of what's expected to have it look like. So that's when you would want to refer to that rule.
Okay. So somebody did ask about the licensor on duty line and what that number was. I did post it. It is 1-800-649-2642. It's the main Child Development Division number. When you call it, you'll get a menu, and the licensor on duty option is option 3. If for some reason those options don't work for you, you can always press 0 and get our admin coordinator, and she'll get you to the right person. Another question we received is when you call the licensor on duty, do they document your question?
It depends on the question. Sometimes someone will call and say, I'm making renovations or my director has left. And they want their licensor to know so that their licensor can support them through that process, or know that they're going to be making a request to come out and do a visit because they're making renovations to their space. And in that case, they tell us who they are, and we do enter a case note so that the licensor is aware what's happening in that program and what they're doing. If you're just calling, asking a clarification rule, you don't really have to tell us who you are. We don't really know who you are, and we don't really need to know who you are to answer a question about a licensing rule. But I like that this question is being asked, because oftentimes people don't ask this question. They're afraid we're going to know who they are, and they're afraid that if they call too many times, we might come out and visit them. And we really tell people, if you're calling us, even if you're calling us on a regular basis, we worry about you less, because you're demonstrating a willingness and interest in being in compliance, and that's not somebody we're worried about. Because our compliance visits are unannounced, you don't know when we're coming. There are times when people might call us the day before that we're coming out for a compliance visit. We try to move those appointments. We don't want people to think that we're showing up as a result of a call. Sometimes you might be overdue for a compliance visit, and we've moved it several times, especially if you're somebody that calls us on a frequent basis. And so we might just say to you, we're coming out soon, and we can't keep moving the appointment. So if we do happen to come out the day after a phone call, please just know it's because you're due. But feel free. The one thing I think is important to know is that all the licensors take turns covering licensor on duty. And right now, each day there's one licensor covering. As of September 1st, we're going to have 2 licensors covering the LOD line every day. And just to handle the call volumes we're anticipating as a result of the new rules, and that it's September 1st and people can really start calling and asking questions. Sometimes people really want to be anonymous. If the person who answers the phone is your licensor, don't say anything. Just go ahead and ask your question. They're probably not going to recognize your voice. If you think they will, just hang up and call back the next day. So we want you to know you might get your licensor, just so it doesn't catch you off guard.
Okay. So are we ready to move to the next example?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
So this is Rule 61513. And if someone can share what page they found that on, 61513.
77.
Great, thank you. So this rule is a little bit different. You'll see that there's an introductory section to this rule, and in the introductory section it says children under 24 months of age shall experience frequent positive interactions with a consistent staff member or team that provides each child with the following opportunities throughout the day. If we put something in the introduction of a rule that has bullets like this, it was that important to us. If we come and that's not in compliance, then we would cite that as in non-compliance. We cite it as a violation. So a key example here is that it talks about consistent staff member or team. So if we see that it's different teachers covering in a particular classroom every single day, that's not consistency for the children. They can't create those attachments and bonds that are needed. We would be citing that as in non-compliance. When you look at the bullets, though, there is a list of things: face-to-face interactions, being held and carried, individual and parallel play, and the list of bullets continues on. Every piece of those bullets are expected to be in compliance, but we would not be citing missing bullets as a violation or non-compliance unless more than 50% of those bullets were missing. So while you do need to be in compliance with all components of it, if we wouldn't be citing the non-compliance unless more than 50% of those bullets were missing. And this is just some helpful information for you as you're thinking about what to expect during a licensing visit and how to read this rule. And this is an example of the kinds of things that we would put for guidance in our guidance manual. So are there other kinds of questions when you think about reading rules? Are there other rules that as you've read them, they've confused you and we could use as examples of how to apply these tips?
Okay. So I do have a few questions that have come in that I did mention that I was going to come back to, so I just need to find your question and, okay. And so we'll cover them or say that unfortunately they're so detailed we won't be able to.
Okay.
So the first question is there a grace period to allow staff to administer medications before they receive the training if they aren't trained by September 1st?
That is a great question. And you can find the answer to that question in Rule 132 on page 1. And it talks about which specific rules we are giving a whole year to come into compliance with. And one of them is medication administration training. The other thing you'll want to be mindful of, and I think this question really gets to this piece, is that we can't really hold you accountable to something when we haven't provided that resource first. So, for example, there's a rule that requires orientation training of everyone in a program. And you can't really do that when a training hasn't been made available yet or hasn't been approved to be used yet. So for those rules where you need something from us in order to do it, like approval of a training or training being available, you'll have time to come into compliance and complete those.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. I'm trying to do two things at once. So we received a question about the training called Protect Vermont Children Reporting Abuse and Neglect Training, also known as the mandated reporter training. Does it meet the requirements for ensuring staff is trained in this area?
Yes, it does.
Perfect. And we had a question about partner staff. So the question is very detailed. Crystal, just let me know if you need me to repeat it. Okay. So one of the regulations says partner staff may not be left alone with children. What happens if it is written in a child's IEP that he or she is to have 2 half-hour visits per week, one-on-one, outside of the classroom? Or if there's an autistic child who needs time out of a classroom with his one-on-one or the special educator from the school district throughout the day?
So there's a variety of ways to handle that situation. And one thing to be mindful of is if the support services for a particular child has them working with a service provider, that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to happen in the license program or as part of a license program. That service provider can sign the child out, work with them, and then sign the child back into the program. If that's happening, if you're releasing that child to a service provider for one-on-one services, whether they're staying in the building or going someplace else, you will want to make sure that you have written parental permission because you're releasing the child to them. And you really want to be clear who has liability responsibility for the child. So that's one way that that can be handled.
Okay. So another question is, does first aid has been administered mean applying a Band-Aid? What exactly counts as first aid has been administered?
And what rule are we talking about there?
583.
Well, let me look at that rule, because I certainly haven't memorized all of these. I think I have only memorized maybe 2. Let me look at 5. You said 583?
Yes.
So the beginning sentence of this rule says, staff shall create and file an incident report for each accident, injury, or medical emergency that leaves a visible mark or first aid has been administered, even when medical treatment is not required. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about 3 different kinds of scenarios: an accident, an injury, or a medical emergency. You might think of a medical emergency as a child that has asthma and they're having an asthmatic attack and they're requiring their medicine. So that certainly is not going to be leaving a visible mark, but it is going to mean that you're administering aid, you're administering care to that child. So that would be a good example of that. So anytime you're doing something as a result of an accident, injury, or medical emergency, you're going to want to be documenting that. And definitely to make sure that parents know that it's occurred and that you've done your part, so that if something as a result of that incident was to have an after effect, you've already shared and the parents are able to do the ongoing monitoring and to make the connection back to, well, this happened earlier today. And it's really going to help medical professionals, especially if it's a kind of after effect that really needs treatment.
Okay.
So I think when I'm thinking about this particular rule, I'm really looking at breaking down the rule of, it's talking about an or, so I really want to make sure of the in this case, 3 components around the or, and then when I connect it to leaves a visible mark or first aid, it really starts to provide clarity about what's being talked about.
Okay, so our next question is, does the 75-foot square foot allowance for outdoor play apply to infants up to 13 months since they do not run vigorously?
Mm-hmm. So this rule is an existing rule. This rule hasn't changed. Your license capacity is based on a multitude of different factors: 35 square feet per child inside, 75 feet per child outside, number of toilets and sinks. Those are existing rules that help establish license capacity, and this rule is the same.
Okay. So the next question is, is there an index that would tell us everywhere a specific word is used? This would enable us to make sure we find the information on a particular thing.
Yes, that's a great question. Our intention is to incorporate an index. And when we were going through the regulation revision process, as you probably can recall, it took a lot longer than we anticipated it taking, and we really wanted to make sure that we got our final documents filed within the allotted time. So what we'll be doing is, in the guidance manuals, incorporating an index in there. So it is a resource that will be coming and be incorporated that way in the guidance manuals. Thanks for asking that question. Indexes are really handy in addition to the table of contents.
Okay. So the next question is, a current Vermont Agency of Education licensed teacher does not have to have copies of professional development in our staff files. 746 is the question, do they not need a copy of their individual professional development plan in their staff files based on that rule?
So let's take a look at Rule 746, and it's on page 93. And it says, staff who hold a current Vermont Agency of Education teaching license with an endorsement in early childhood education, early childhood special education, or elementary education. So it's specific to those 4 types of teaching licenses, and there's certainly other teaching licenses, shall use their current teaching license as documented verification of completing the individualized professional development requirement. So it's saying that the teaching license is the documentation. And this is a place where you're going to find the guidance manual will help, because it'll be able to provide some of the understanding behind the licensing rule. So in this particular case, in order to have a teaching license, you have to be you have to have an individualized professional development plan that you submit to Agency of Education when you renew your teaching license. And you have to have completed ongoing professional development, and you have to submit verification of that to the Agency of Education when you're renewing your teaching license. So this is one of those places that we really felt like we could cut out the redundancy. If you're already doing that with Agency of Education, and they're giving you a new license as a result of that, the Child Development Division doesn't feel it necessary to also then look at that same paperwork. So you'll take that new valid certificate and you'll send it to Vermont Northern Lights using their cover sheet. They'll upload it into your professional, the BFIS quality and credential account, and a licensing staff can see that it's in there. And we won't go beyond that because we know AOE is already monitoring that.
So, do infants count when establishing the total number of children allowed per bathroom?
Yes, infants count.
Okay. And so the next was a suggestion that I'll also answer. And so that was around, if we don't have the index currently, is it possible to have an online document that has a search feature so an individual could look up words? And I just want to let you know the regulations are online in PDF format. You can download them, keep them on your computer, or you can actually, there is a search function that is active on that document. So you can search the document for any word. It will come up. Also, if you save it on your computer and use the PDF reader search function, the words will also come up there too. So it actually already does have that search feature, but you're coming up with the words yourself.
Thank you.
So if we want to move on, and if we've been able, if we have time, we'll circle back to some questions that we might have not hit yet.
So we definitely want to spend some time on our last objective of this webinar, which is to provide you with some resources. So let's look at this list. We have resources from a variety of sources, starting with the Child Development Division, your local community child care support agency, or you might know it as your resource and referral agency, registered nurse child care wellness consultant, Vermont Birth to 5, Vermont Community Loan Fund, and Vermont Northern Lights. So within these particular resources, are services that will help support compliance to these new regulations. And we're going to show you how to access an online tool. So if you go to the Child Development Division website and you go under Laws and Regulations and scroll down to the Frequently Asked Questions section, you click on that link. And then once you're on this page, you can see under General Questions, we have the third to last bullet, and it has the word new under it because this was posted more recently. The other things posted on that site have been there longer. And you click on that one, and you'll see where it says resources are available to help you with regulations. At the end of that is a link, and if you click on that link, it takes you to this resource page. And let's just talk a little bit about what some of these different resources have that will help you with achieving compliance to the new regulations. The Child Development Division has our website, and there's all sorts of different components of our website. The regulations that Heather was just talking about, you can access them. If parents, if you're giving parents copies of regulations, you can put this link right out there in email form or forward it to them so they can access them. You want to use our Frequently Asked Questions site. We're going to be posting updated responses and answering more and more questions about different rules and specifics about rules. So that's a place you're going to want to frequent at least weekly to see what's being posted and what's new there. Another resource is our licensing newsletters. We typically send those out quarterly. And that is our ongoing communication. That's where we're going to be able to talk about, you know, how's implementation going, what are we learning, what might we want to tell you about. We cite themes of different things that are happening around frequent violations that we're noticing, or sometimes we give you tips about certain rules. So that licensing newsletters is a helpful resource. And you can go, starting with this summer's newsletter, you can search those. So if you want to go back and see former ones. Another section of our website has sample forms. So there already are a few sample forms there. And as a result of these new rules, we're going to be continuing to develop sample forms. And as we do that, we'll post them to that section. You're welcome to create your own form. You're welcome to copy a form from us and use it as we've drafted it. Or you're welcome to take our form and modify it for your purposes. So please feel free to use any of those any way that works best for you and your program. We do have a section of our website that has grants that support things like college course costs. So if you have staff that need some funding support for coursework, there's that grant section of our website might be helpful to you. We have another part of our website that focuses on professional development, and yet another section on health and safety guidance and resources. And of course, the licensor on duty line. It's always available. If you look at your local community child support agency, if you're not sure who your agency is in your area, the link is there so that you can see all the different locations and identify which one is near you. So your resource development specialist, they do a variety of different things, but the three things that we mentioned here are the things that relate to these new rules. Professional development opportunities, talking with you about supporting staff with achieving new qualifications, and what are the resources, and when are they available, and how do you get connected to them. That's something the resource development specialist will be able to help you with. Developing quality policies and procedures. They're always going to be able to tell you current research, best practices, what's happening in terms of different policies and procedures. They can also help link you with additional resources. And as we mentioned earlier, they have additional copies of the licensing regulations should you want them. So the next one, you may or may not be familiar with, a registered nurse child care wellness consultant. In Vermont, we're all familiar with 911 and if there's an emergency. And there is also 211. If you call 211, you're going to get a support around pretty much any topic you can think of. They can provide you a referral or connections or information on. And one of those things is connecting you with a registered nurse child care wellness consultant. If you're participating in the STARS program, the consultant services are free for your program. and they can provide education support with developing health and safety policies and procedures. And there's some bullets that highlight some of the things that they can help you with. Safe cleaning, if you're looking for environmentally friendly cleaning projects that will get the job done, they can help you with that. If you're doing emergency planning or injury prevention, you need some guidance around that. So you can read the list there of the different things that they can provide supports around. So that's a resource. Vermont Versa 5, again, like these other entities that we're mentioning, Vermont Versa 5 services go well beyond the bullets that we have here, but these are the things that they provide for supports that directly connect to this licensing regulations. They have mentoring services for both center and home-based programs. They provide professional development guidance and support, and they oftentimes might even provide professional development training themselves. They also have shared services. So if you're participating in STARS and connected with Vermont Versa 5, you might be able to use their shared services. It has a lot of discounts where multiple providers are purchasing things as a group, and so the cost is less. So it might be a cost savings to your program to look to see what kinds of discounts they have available. They also have tools and resources. So they might have sample handbooks if you're looking at updating and revising your handbook and you want to see what some others look like, and you can utilize those. So here's some examples of ways that they might be helpful. The next one is the Vermont Community Loan Fund, and again, they provide more services than the two we're listing, but the two we're listing connect with these regulations. The free business planning support can be really helpful, especially if you're trying to think about how to budget and save for some things that might have some cost associated with them. Their services are for free. They'll help you think through that. They'll help you look at your income and your expenses and balance that out and see where you might be able to do some savings or shift some budgeting around to accommodate for some of the things you need to do. They also offer financial funding, low-interest child care loans, for businesses that might need that. Maybe you're renovating or you're making modifications, then you need some funding to be able to do that. The next one is Vermont Northern Lights, and like the others, the bullets listed here are just a few of what they provide for services, but they do enter qualifications, resumes, and professional development into BFIS quality and credential accounts. So if you have some documentation that needs to get into your BFIS account or a staff person's account, they can support you through that process. They can tell you what's needed and what documentation has to look like. They can also provide guidance and support around developing individualized professional development plans. Their career ladder, they have the applications and they provide guidance around the different level certificates, whether it's an early childhood level certificate or an after school or a director credentialing. And if you're questioning where yourself or staff fall on qualifications, one of the easiest ways for you maybe to assess where you're at is to apply for a level certificate. And Northern Lights will be able to take a look at, okay, so you're at a level 2, and in order to get to a level 3, you need this, this, or that. And by looking at that level certificate, it might be a lot clearer where you fall in the qualifications in these rules. They also provide information on professional development opportunities as well, online resources and classes, as well as in-person options around the state. So we wanted to share these resources because we hear a lot of questions about where can I get financial support, where can I get support around qualifications, where can I get support around developing policies and procedures, and these are some of the places you can go to, and this will stay right on our website. So before we spend time, if we have a couple minutes, we'll come back to any last-minute questions. But I do want to take a moment and just reflect on our objectives from tonight's webinar. And we really spent some time on each of these 3 areas, really talking about the implementation plan and what to expect along the process, and that this is a process. No one needs to be in compliance with everything by September 1st. and we still have a lot of training left to do for ourselves and for you guys. We've talked about basic tips and we're reading different licensing rules, and we've shared some resources with you. After today, we really want to remember that we know change is never easy. It can be very anxiety-provoking, especially when you think about things that are familiar are going to become unfamiliar, to the extent that some of these rules have not changed and we will read them as if they're new. So we know that that happens. It also takes time. You have to read new rules, you have to understand them, you have to apply them. Sometimes we know change isn't easy because it can jeopardize our sense of control, and sometimes we just feel resistant to it. And those of us here at the division feel that as well. We have that in common with you. We also know that change is a lot to manage because you're having to manage your own attitudes and emotions. You're having to stay informed. You're taking time to care for yourself throughout this process. So we want to be mindful of that. We also want to share with you that CDD plans on continuing to do what we've been doing up until this point, and that is sharing as much with you as frequently as we can. Some of these same topics we covered last fall at VACI conference workshops. We're going to be at the VACI conference this fall. We were at non-recurring conference last fall, winter. They had their conference in December, and we're going to be at the non-recurring conference this December. So we're traveling around, we're holding these webinars, our newsletters. There's all sorts of ways for us to communicate information and share it with you. We also want you to know that we're going to continue to listen. We did a lot of listening around public feedback and incorporating that into changes to these rules, whether we modified them or deleted a rule. And we're going to continue to use what we learn from these webinars and what you give us for feedback, and especially the trainings in the fall to help guide the writing of the guidance manual. So that's some of what we plan on continuing to do. In terms of your role, we know that you've been successful once. You have a license. You learned licensing rules. Some of you are even in the STARS program and have gone beyond, and you've learned quality standards, and you've applied those to your programs. So in terms of learning these rules, we know that you guys are already successful at accomplishing that. And you're certainly going to be able to do it again, and we'll work together to accomplish that. One of the things we want to challenge you to do is be curious. How will this change your program for the better when you have these rules implemented? And what will happen if this works well? What will that mean for your program? So using that curiosity to be some of your fuel over the next year. Ultimately, this isn't really about licensing or about your program. This is about the work we all do to serve Vermont's children and families. So we really want to continue to take this team approach, and we'll be as patient with you as you are with us as we find rules together and clarify and get questions. So
great. So we really have about 1 minute, so I just want to take this time to first thank everyone for joining us tonight. And also to just clarify again that there are professional development hours for attending if you are logged in to your own computer or mobile device. And I will be sending out the professional development form early next week. So you will get a certificate in an email from our software program, but you'll also be getting another certificate from me early next week. In addition, we will be submitting those professional development hours into BSIS, and all the questions that we were able to get to and the ones that unfortunately we weren't able to get to because we ran out of time, we will be putting them into the frequently asked questions, so you can look there. We'll be trying to answer as many as we can each week. So even if you don't see them this week or next week, you will see them soon and our detailed answers. A few people asked some very specific questions about their program, about themselves and their professional development. And I would recommend, if it's a very specific question to your program or to yourself and your professional development, you may want to call the licensor on duty and find out if they can give you that answer now or talk you through that. So those are just some suggestions, and thank you so much for participating with us tonight.